And when Jefferson's writing the Declaration, he's talking about the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he can't call property unalienable because property is obviously alienable. The idea is that we're all born in a state of nature, and when we form governments, we alienate or surrender certain of our natural rights in order to get greater security and safety of the rights we've retained. You have to be able to alienate property to give it value and also to give the government the power to enforce contracts. But you can't alienate the right to pursue happiness because our happiness is rooted in our reason and our freedom of conscience. And I can't give you the power to control my reason or my thoughts because they are inherent in who I am as a human being. The mind must be free.
Welcome to the Beyond High Performance podcast, featuring content and conversations from me, Jason Jaggard, along with our elite coaches at Novus Global, their high-performing clients, and the faculty of the Meta Performance Institute for Coaching. On this podcast, you'll hear some of the world's best executive coaches and high-performing leaders, artists, and athletes discuss how they continue to go beyond high performance in their lives and businesses. Welcome to the Meta Performance Show. Today I speak with Jeff Rosen, the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. He's also professor at the George Washington University Law School and contributing editor to The Atlantic. He's a prolific writer of 7 books, including his most recent, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America, which, by the way, is about the Constitution, not the movie starring Will Smith. He's also the host of the We the People podcast, which you should definitely check out, where he brings together both liberals and conservatives for civil and thoughtful debate. Known for his deep understanding of law, history, and philosophy, Jeff has dedicated his life to fostering meaningful, nonpartisan dialogue about the Constitution and its enduring role in American life. From his early passion for literature and politics to his current role at the National Constitution Center, Jeff shares how this mission aligns with his personal calling to bridge divides and inspire understanding in a polarized world. In our conversation, we explore the Constitution's brilliant design, a system deliberately crafted to balance reason and passion while ensuring that ultimate power rests with we the people. And then we dive into how America's founders were profoundly influenced by ancient Greek philosophy, Enlightenment thinkers, and the timeless pursuit of virtue. Rosen reveals how these concepts articulated by great thinkers of our past were embraced by Franklin, Jefferson, and other political leaders, and how they continue to hold powerful lessons for leadership, self-improvement, and civic responsibility today. Enjoy the show. Jeff, thanks so much for being on our show. Happy to have you.
Great to be here.
This is the first time we've had like a scholar on our show, and I'm thrilled to introduce you to our world. I mean, I guess one lazy question to start our conversation was how old were you when you realized that you were smart?
I never thought or think I'm smart. I just, my mom inspired me to work hard and to read a lot. So that was what I did. And I've just been doing it ever since.
Yeah, but I mean, and that's nice, and I appreciate the deference and the humility, and Benjamin Franklin will be very proud of you, which we'll get into in a little bit. And there had to have been a moment as you're discerning, like where your competitive advantages are in terms of adding value to the world, and where your passions are. You know, we'll get into some of your creative endeavors later on the show, but there had to have been a moment when you're like, oh, I think I can use my brain for a living. What was that journey like?
I never thought that, but I did. I actually felt in college like my mission in life was somehow to bring together literature and politics. I was an English major. I loved writing. I loved reading, and wanted to join it with government, and felt that was what I was supposed to do. And then in law school, I felt like I was supposed to bring together liberals and conservatives. And in both of those missions, I just didn't know how it was going to work out. And synchronistically, I was just given this amazing opportunity at the National Constitution Center, which was founded by Congress to bring together liberals and conservatives for debate about literature and politics. And it's just so incredibly satisfying to be fulfilling a mission that I felt like I was given a long time ago.
Is it fair to say that's your day job? Because there's so many things, you're kind of a polymath. There's so many things that you're up to. Would you define that as the day job?
Absolutely. It's my main gig.
Your main gig. All right, great. So then this episode is dropping right around the inauguration. And of course, this is so many things have been said about this election and the last several, in some ways, decades of professional politics. So I won't wax poetic there because that all sounds like cliches by this point. And the National Constitution Center is important for the very reasons you just described. Could you explain to our audience a little bit more about what the National Constitution Center is, why it's important? I'd be thrilled if one of the outcomes of this conversation is everyone gets their phones out and Googles what you're up to like right now as you're listening to us. So go ahead and explain to our audience what the National Constitution Center is and why you're so passionate about it.
I start all of our programs and podcasts by reciting the National Constitution Center's mission statement, which comes from it comes from Congress, and listeners from We the People can do it by heart. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis. And it's so inspiring to have that mission created during the bicentennial of the Constitution to bring together liberals and conservatives for nonpartisan constitutional dialogue and debate. And we do it on all platforms. First of all, we're this amazing museum on Independence Mall in Philadelphia. And anyone who saw the presidential debate saw the NCC, because that's where it is. And it's just this inspiring temple to the Constitution with the greatest views of Independence Hall in America that has exhibits for kids and statues of the framers and rare copies of the Constitution and live theater. And it's just an amazingly inspiring place for learners of all ages to visit. But then, and I always feel like a Ginsu knife salesman when I'm talking about everything.
But that's not all.
That's not all. It's just this incredible platform online to educate learners of all ages about the Constitution. So we have a weekly podcast that I host, We the People, which brings together liberals and conservatives for constitutional debate. We have programs on Zoom and on audio that bring together scholars and thought leaders and people of all backgrounds for constitutional education. And then there are these amazing Constitution 101 classes for high school kids, middle school kids, college kids, and adults. There's a version on the NCC's website, and we've just launched a version with Khan Academy, which is their first major civics course. They do a lot of math and science, but never civics before, with the greatest constitutional scholars in America, all debating the basics of the Constitution. And finally, it's all hosted on this platform called the Interactive Constitution, which has gotten more than 80 million hits now since we launched in 2015. And it brings together top liberals and conservatives to discuss every clause of the Constitution. So you can find Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal with 1,000 words on what they agree the habeas corpus clause means, and then separate statements about what they disagree about, and multiply that by 80 clauses, 160 scholars. It's just a feast, and it's so exciting to see these scholars who strongly disagree about aspects of the Constitution also identifying common ground. So that's what we do, and it is just a privilege to be part of it.
Woo! well done. I'm buying.
Good.
So let's go to first principles around this for a second, because this is the Meta Performance Show. I want to brag about you just for a second, because you do. I have read many books on the Constitution, and I enjoy them, and I don't want to discredit, again, anybody else who I may talk to, but yours are so readable. Like, you make it so enjoyable to read, and that is not an easy subject to make digestible and readable. And to turn that into a question, like, what's your process? What's your writing process for making things that can feel so esoteric or so abstract or so philosophical digestible for really anybody? Because I could recommend your book that we're going to talk about in a second to anybody.
I'm so glad you find the book readable. That's exactly the goal. I was a journalist for the first half of my career, and I still feel that I'm a journalist at heart. I started off as the legal affairs editor of the New Republic magazine right out of law school, and then wrote for the New York Times magazine and the New Yorker, and I'm now at the Atlantic. And a New Yorker editor gave me the best writing advice that I've ever had. He said, write like you're telling it to someone over dinner. And that just changed the way I wrote, less formal and more conversational. So now I just try to write as clearly as possible. If there's a complicated idea I don't understand, I have to get it in my head so I can restate it in simple terms. And that's the way I write. And for the final draft, I read the books out loud to my wife, Lauren, to make sure they sound well. And that's the goal. But the only connect, E.M. Forster said, and that is my goal in writing and speaking.
That's wonderful. It reminds me a little bit of Aaron Sorkin. I don't know if you're a Sorkin fan, but he always talks about how language is like poetry. It has temperament, like speech has temperament, pitch, tone, rhythm, and to write something that not only make sense when you read it, but as a listener hears it in their own heads, it's like art, it's like music.
So true. I had so many wonderful teachers of English and literature and writing. And one of the greats in college, a scholar named Walter Jackson Bate, who wrote spectacular biographies of John Keats and Samuel Johnson. And in his class on the age of Johnson, Bate would read Johnson's sentences out loud so we could hear the music and the rhythm. The greatest path of the human imagination is not from pleasure to pleasure, but from hope to hope. The pleasures of sudden wonder are soon exhausted, and the mind can only repose in the stability of truth. And you can just hear the balance and the antithesis and the slow expansion, and it is music. And that is what great writing is.
Well, and just in case people are listening to this, Jeff just recited that from memory. And so it's
Well, no, it was because Bate would read it out loud, and he also loved to read poetry out loud, and he was a beautiful reader of poetry, and he said, "Read it slowly and bring out the emphasis," and it really is like spoken music. I'll just plug his he's such a great humanist, and he has a collection called Criticism, the Major Texts, which with introductions to the work of the great critics from ancient times to today. And it's just such a case for why the humanities matter. And we've got to read literature and novels and poetry for what can be put to use and teach us how to live. And that's exactly what Bate inspired me to do.
yeah, and then not only how to live, but like what's worth living for. What I'd like to do is ask a few questions. We're going to start with just first principles of the Constitution. Like, why would you say the Constitution, understanding the Constitution, is valuable for Americans today and even people internationally? Why is this document, understanding the founding leaders' thoughts, important?
You know, I was just having dinner last night with Jeff Yass, who's a friend, a great entrepreneur, and a philanthropist who made possible the National Constitution Center's collaboration with Khan Academy and allowed us to create that great Constitution 101 course. And he said the three principles of the Constitution are what makes America the greatest economy in the world and the freest country in the world. And they are limited government, separation of powers, and free speech and free expression. And that just summed it up. I mean, it just is why it matters, is because it allows the freedom that allows us to thrive. And it pays off because we've just outperformed economically less free countries. And that's the beginning of why the Constitution matters and why freedom matters.
And I remember reading one of Thomas Paine's quotes, like, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." And I remember reading that years ago and thinking, who talks like that? like Steve Jobs invented the phone, Henry Ford invented a car. The founding leaders of our country, they invented a civilization, and they did it on purpose. And that to me is very romantic. And so I'd love to talk about our founding leaders as people who went beyond high performance, as people who continually reinvented what was possible for themselves. Talk to us a little bit about these people from the context of like leadership.
Well, the first thing to say is that they were very conscious of the fact that they were founders who would inscribe their names into history. The ancient philosophers who they read said there was no higher office than being a founder of a new state, like Solon in Greece or Lycurgus. And they realized how privileged they were to be founding America anew. The other thing is that they read the same books, and they read the classical philosophers, and they read Enlightenment philosophers, and they read the Bible, and they believed in certain core principles of the liberal idea, which became the American idea, in particular, liberty, equality, and government by consent, the three big principles of the Declaration of Independence. So they were very self-consciously trying to create governments that would protect those values, liberty, equality, and government by consent. And they shared a common framework that allowed them to do that. They were conscious of the significance of what they were doing, and they shared common values. Now, of course, they disagreed about how to apply those values, and the totemic battles between Hamilton and Jefferson about national power versus states' rights, or democracy versus rule by elites, or liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution, resonated throughout American history. And in fact, my next book is about exactly that topic, how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson continues to define America. But that's all within the framework of that agreement about first principles. I'll just start there, and then we can talk about individual framers and how they were able to be so productive, focused, and successful because of their values.
Well, and I like that you mentioned this a few times now, like the separation of powers, and there was these constant tensions that they were managing. And in our work, we talk about unidoxical thought, like where you can only like hold one idea in your head at a time, and then paradoxical thought. I think it was Einstein who said that the evidence of a first-rate mind is that you can hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. And then what we talk a lot about in the firm is multidoxical thought, which is where you can hold an ecosystem of paradoxes in tension with each other at the same time. And that, from our perspective, that really is like an evidence of top-tier thinking that people should aspire towards and pursue. And I don't know if I've ever seen a better example of multidoxical thinking than Jefferson, Franklin, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, like people in the first 50 to 100 years of our history.
It's so true. What a great way to put it, multidoxical thinking. And think of the complexity of the Constitution. It is so determined to prevent concentrating power in any aspect of government, because the ultimate power belongs to we the people, that it parcels and separates and balances and checks government power both vertically and horizontally. Horizontally among the branches of government, the president, the legislative, and the executive, and vertically between the national government and the states. And then the states are further subdivided into local bodies, and no one is allowed to speak for we the people. And in order to do that, you've got to get all the different pieces to agree. It slows down deliberation so that mobs can't form quickly and people aren't able to make hasty judgments. And throughout, it is animated by the central tension between reason and passion. That was so exciting for me to discover, how this antithesis between reason and passion was both the central definition of virtue in classical moral psychology and also political philosophy. And it comes from Pythagoras. Who knew that Pythagoras, in addition to founding the harmonic system and the triangle, if that weren't enough, is the founder of Greek moral philosophy, and opposes reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and says our goal in politics and in life is to use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and emotions, so we can achieve that calm tranquility and harmony that defines virtue. Think of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and at the end of the Ethics, he's got a chart called the golden mean, and he identifies a series of passions or emotions. And for each one, there's an excess and a deficiency. You want to be neither rash nor insensible, but moderate. And by taking the moderate golden mean for each emotion, you reach the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. And that's what you got to do in your personal life. Don't get distracted by unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear that prevent you from achieving your potential. And that's what you've got to do in your political life. And the whole Constitution is structured to achieve the same calm, tranquility, and moderation in the Constitution of the state as we're supposed to achieve in our own mind. I could say more, but it's extraordinary how symmetrical and balanced and visionary the worldview is, and all founded in a transcendent faith in reason. These are men of the Enlightenment, and they believe in the power of reason to make the world anew, to moderate unreasonable emotions, and to be our best selves.
Well, and so now we're dipping into the locus of your last book, and I think it would surprise people to know that Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, and others were obsessed, and I think that's an appropriate word, were obsessed with ancient Greek philosophy and, of course, Judeo-Christian. Most people know a little bit more about the fact that they were obsessed with Judeo-Christian philosophy and the theology of that, and that was a heavy influence. What might be lesser known is that they were really obsessed with ancient Greek Stoic philosophy in a way that I knew that a little bit, but then when I read your book, I was like, oh my goodness, like the Stoics' fingerprints are on everything that they did, created, and I'd never known that, and I'm curious, why do you think that's true, that I've been so informed about the founding fathers? You grow up in school learning about them, but you don't learn necessarily about the amazing thinkers that influenced them.
I didn't know it either. It just blew my mind and provoked this completely unusual, weird reading project that I had in COVID to read these books of classical moral philosophy. What turned me on to the whole thing was just seeing this reading list that Jefferson would send to anyone who asked when he was old, how can I be an educated person? And the reading list is incredible for its breadth. It's got moral philosophy and political philosophy and ancient history and law and literature and novels and science. But what caught my eye was the section on moral philosophy. And at the top of the list was this book by Cicero I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations, that it turns out both Jefferson and Franklin used as their core definition of happiness. And then other books from the Stoics and the Enlightenment, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's Letters, Epictetus, as well as John Locke and Francis Hutcheson and Lord Bolingbroke and David Hume. I decided to read these books because I'd never heard of them before. I've had this amazing liberal arts education, as we talked about, I studied literature and history and politics with all these great teachers, but I never read these moral philosophy books, I think because they've fallen out of the curriculum by the time I was in college in the 1980s. So I read them. It was totally life-changing to see how clear and central the message of the philosophers, which is that virtuous self-mastery and self uh, improvement are necessary for happiness,
Hmm.
and also how all of the founders read the same books. Jefferson went to William and Mary. Franklin was essentially self-educated in Philadelphia. John Adams went to Harvard, Madison to Princeton. Regardless of where they were educated or the degrees of their backgrounds, they all read these books as kids, and it totally shaped their worldview. So that's why these books are so central to understanding the founding.
When you mentioned virtue is necessary for happiness, I want to go there for a second, because the title of the book, again, is The Pursuit of Happiness. And most people have heard that phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I just learned recently that one of the previous phrases was life, liberty, and property. And the way that it was explained to me was life is like your future, because if you kill someone, you're stealing their future. And then liberty is your present, freedom to make choices in the present, and then property was your past, to say like it's the evidence of your hard work, you're accumulating wealth. And then so I thought that was fascinating, but I thought it was more fascinating that they actually changed it. They decided not to go with that version. They decided to change it to happiness. Maybe this is an obvious question for you, but do you know why they decided to shift it from property to happiness?
I do, and it's a kind of technical answer that has to do with natural rights theory. The idea that life, liberty, and property are natural rights comes from John Locke's second treatise on government, which says exactly that. But there's another book of John Locke called The Essay Concerning Human Understanding that defines the pursuit of happiness, first of all, as impulse control, as kind of virtuous self-mastery, and calls it an unalienable right. And when Jefferson's writing the Declaration, he's talking about the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he can't call property unalienable because property is obviously alienable. The idea is that we're all born in a state of nature, and when we form governments, we alienate or surrender certain of our natural rights in order to get greater security and safety of the rights we've retained. You have to be able to alienate property to give it value and also to give the government the power to enforce contracts. But you can't alienate the right to pursue happiness because our happiness is rooted in our reason and our freedom of conscience. And I can't give you the power to control my reason or my thoughts because they are inherent in who I am as a human being. The mind must be free. So that is why Jefferson, a very careful draftsman and also student of natural rights, says that happiness but not property is unalienable, and that's where we got the phrase.
Well, and I want to go back to how you defined happiness, because I think that's probably, to me, that's maybe my favorite part of your book, and it's something that I learned a while ago, and I was so thrilled when I saw someone codify it in literature the way that you did with your book. Is when the founding fathers used the word happiness, it's like an Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride. Like, I don't think it means what you think it means, right?
Absolutely.
Right, and because when we use it today, it's like, fast cars and decadence and big houses, and those things are fine, but also that's not even remotely close. It wasn't like chocolates and, all those things. It was something else. Can you explain a little bit more? Because you just kind of riff past it, and it's so important. Can you talk a little bit more about the distinction between how oftentimes we look at happiness today and how the people who framed our Constitution and created our government looked at it, and of course, how they were getting that from the ancient philosophers?
Absolutely. The ancient philosophers understood happiness to be the opposite of the way we understand it today. We understand happiness as feeling good. They understood it as being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by virtue, they really did mean self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement, and impulse control. Remember the Stanford marshmallow test from the 1970s? Kids who are like 5 years old or something are able to get one marshmallow if they want it immediately. They get two if they can wait for 15 minutes. The kids who could wait just did better later in life. They did better in school and better in their relationships and at work because they could control their impulses. And that's really what the core definition of happiness was. The classical definition comes from Aristotle, and he says in the Nicomachean Ethics, happiness or eudaimonia or good spirit is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. But because excellence and virtue aren't self-defining, it's hard to know exactly what he means in modern terms. But excellence and virtue meant for the founders what we would call emotional intelligence. Really, it's just controlling your worst impulses so you can cultivate your best impulses and be your best self. Uh, and that definition completely fell out of pop culture sometime around the 1960s when happiness was transformed from being good to feeling good. And as you said, fast cars and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and all. Uh, and that's why this old definition was so unfamiliar and it's so important and interesting to resurrect.
Well, in many ways necessary, right? Because I don't know if you can scale societies. I do feel, bear with me here for a second, that the American experiment only works if people take personal responsibility for the pursuit of virtue. If we do not take personal responsibility for the pursuit of virtue and try to outsource that into other institutions, this whole thing doesn't work well. And I guess I'm kind of fact checking with you. Am I seeing that correctly to say that the people who created this system hundreds of years ago never imagined it being able to work unless we took virtue, character, and the kind of the way that the Greeks define that so seriously that it was actually buttressing the institutions from the inside?
You are completely correct. And in fact, there is no message that the founders gave more frequently than the one you just gave. Unless individuals find virtuous self-mastery in themselves, then the republic will collapse. We will go the way of Greece and Rome and every other previous republic, which all fell to demagogues or the mob or people who or leaders who promise cheap luxuries in exchange for people surrendering their liberty. Um, or factions like the Red Rose and the White Rose of the English Tudors and the civil wars that convulsed England for so long. Uh, this was the story of every republic in history. And that's why George Washington, in his farewell address, is warning of the dangers of faction,
Hmm.
namely groups animated by passion rather than reason, who will subvert the Union out of ego-based self-interest rather than a devotion to the public good. And that's why all of the founders are not sure that the experiment will succeed. They have different degrees of optimism or pessimism. Washington fears faction. Hamilton thinks the executive is not strong enough. Jefferson probably fears civil war over slavery. Only Madison is a little more optimistic because he expects less. He's moderate, and he also has a lot of faith in this new media technology called the broadside press. And he's really excited that citizens are going to read complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers. And with the help of a new class of statesmen called the literati, they will be able to thoughtfully allow their passions to be tamed by reason, and that will have reason will pervade the republic. So I mean, we're talking about it and laughing because it's so far from our current universe, which looks so much like James Madison's nightmare.
Well, and see, this is actually a little bit of a side point, but I'm curious what you think. I do find farewell addresses so interesting. When Eisenhower warned of the dangers of the growing influence of the industrial military complex. Of course, you mentioned Washington when his thing that he was terrified of were essentially political parties. And I find it interesting now in your work that and by the way, We the People, I highly recommend people checking out your podcast. It is a delight to listen to. It is such an anecdote to the kind of rabid and vapid bad faith arguing of the polarity, the polarization of what we're dealing with in public discourse. And if you could wave a magic wand, Jeff, like would you I don't even know how to frame the question other than would you dissolve political parties? Like what do you think Washington's ideal was that would make him warn people against the very thing that we have now been becoming so embedded in now?
Washington is very much rooted in classical philosophy and in the civic republican opposition to the English kings that believed that you had to have a government without parties, and they see parties as the enemy. Of course, he's writing or speaking at a time when the parties are up and running, founded by none other than his closest advisors, Hamilton and Adams for the Federalists, and Madison and Jefferson for the Democratic Republicans. Madison, always flexible, always open to changing his mind, changes his mind on parties, and soon after writes an essay on the necessity of political parties. And Madison, who had previously opposed them as factions, says they're inevitable. Every society is going to have them. And in the end, they could be helpful in allowing the interests of the Democratic majority of the country to prevail over the aristocratic minority that's just out for itself. So he views the political parties as a way of actually representing majority will against the aristocratic Federalists. By contrast, Hamilton, for the Federalists, thinks that the parties will protect property rights and government stability and union against the depredations of the mob. And pretty soon, both sides come to accept parties not as factions, but as ways of building multi-faction coalitions that can balance interests in a pluralistic way. And in fact, for much of American history, that turns out to be the way the parties have actually operated. So it was the big thing the founders didn't anticipate, but they were flexible enough both to preside over the formation of the parties and ultimately to think they were a good thing.
That's fascinating. So then what do you think it was that Washington got wrong? And obviously, like, I mean that with an asterisk next to it, but like, what did he not see that ended up working?
Well, he was wrong in equating parties with factions, but he was right in worrying that when the people descended into faction and passion and tweeting their worst self and trying to own the libs or own the conservatives or not taking the time to educate themselves about civics, the republic would be in peril. Washington's main antidote to faction is a national university that he wants to create in Washington, D.C. He wants people from around the country, young people, to set aside their regional prejudices and passions, to learn from each other, and to learn two things. First, the science of politics and the principles of government, and second, the habits of civil deliberation, how to disagree without being disagreeable, how to be open-minded and open to changing their minds. And those two crucial purposes of civic education remain necessary for saving the republic. And to the degree that we're just descending into passion and faction, we're vindicating Washington's fears.
That's right. And there's like over-indexing into the emotional, into the pathological, into the we could call it passion, but it's a certain kind of passion. It's like a degrading passion or a destructive passion or a passion of bad faith or like it's because I can imagine when you partner reason with passion, it produces this wonderful cocktail of what we might call like wisdom. And if you try to separate them, then you get it like Frankenstein's monster. Like you get this kind of horrible cocktail that we sometimes experience more in our political discourse than maybe we wish we would.
Exactly. Beautifully put. Remember, passion is a synonym for emotion in Greek, and pathos is passion, logos is reason. And not all emotions are bad. The goal is to cultivate productive rather than unproductive emotions. So that's why the unproductive ones are the ones that you just mentioned, like anger and fear and jealousy and greed and avarice and all the things that have led to war. Whereas temperance, prudence, courage, and justice, moderation, industry, frugality, all of these productive passions are things that we want to cultivate. And to the degree that polarization and these new technologies are riling us up, personalizing politics, creating politics as warfare, and leading us to demonize our opponents, we're being driven by our unproductive rather than our productive passion.
Which makes Stoicism so relevant today. So you mentioned this a few times. I just want to make sure our audience is hearing it in terms of the founders of our country believed that what we might call good character or what you call virtue is an actual competitive advantage, that it actually enhances your freedoms. It actually enhances your capacity to be successful in life, in work, in relationships. That if you really want to be successful, it's not about necessarily how attractive you are and necessarily how much money you have, et cetera, et cetera. It's about the internal mechanisms that allow you to navigate the world successfully, not only for yourself, but in tandem with others. And you, Jeff, you do a great job in your book, The Pursuit of Happiness, of walking through a series of virtues. And so what I like to do is I like to talk about some of those virtues and then how your best understanding of how the Greeks would have defined those things and how they influenced the founding fathers. And then we'll double click on some mechanics things. So you just did a list there previously. Can you say some of the things? We won't touch on all of them, obviously. And by the way, I highly recommend you checking out his book because he does a nice deep dive into many of the virtues that the Stoics talked about and the founding fathers were obsessed over. But like, give us a few of your favorites, and then we can talk about some of the men that you feature in that, and one of the women, and we can go from there.
Well, start with temperance, which Franklin said is the virtue that he owed all of his success to. Imagine this. He's the most famous man in the world, and he has invented lightning and tamed the Gulf Stream, and he says that he owes his success to the fact that he learned early on not to be too tendentious in expressing his opinions, not to say, this is the way it is, but perhaps, or it may be so, or it occurs to me. And that's what allowed him to conciliate at the Constitutional Convention and persuade everyone to make it unanimous, even though there were disagreements, and also to um, uh, be the greatest diplomat of his age. So that emotional virtue of temperance, far from being some mushy middle compromise, Franklin thinks is crucial to all of his success. And that's why he wants to create a united party of virtue where people would meet in small groups. He called them the junto, which means to join, but they're like reading groups today. And they'd read good books, and they'd um, practice self-accounting every night in the spirit of Pythagoras, who said every night before we go to bed, we should make a list of our how we've fared on achieving virtue and put an X mark where we've fallen short. And that's why Franklin made his list of 13 virtues, of which temperance is one, also moderation, industry, cleanliness, order, frugality. He saved the one he found hardest for last, humility. And he said, he put them all on a chart, and every night he resolved to do some self-accounting and put an X mark where he fell short. He tried this for a while. He found it incredibly depressing because there were so many X marks, but he felt like he was a better person for having tried. And that system, the Franklin system of moral improvement, has been practiced widely ever since, and gives you a sense of how, for the founders, the pursuit of virtue it's a practical, daily, hourly affair. It's something where by definition we know that we're going to fall short, but by trying we become more perfect.
Well, and it's funny because even with temperance, and I remember laughing as that you've chose that as the first chapter of your to lead off with Franklin as a guy who bought ink by the barrel, and I think had like 13 different pseudonyms, and public so for uh, there is something wonderfully ironic about each of the virtues, and there is a danger that I think that we all must choose when we decide to say that I care about virtue. Because as soon as you say you care about a virtue, period, and as soon as you even what the founding fathers did, bifurcate those into other virtues and get specific about it, you open yourself up to criticism of being accused of being a hypocrite. And because Franklin wanted to be temperate, and also he was not in so many ways.
It's so true. In fact, he wanted to practice order, and John Adams was appalled by how disorganized he was. He would visit him in Paris and said his papers were everywhere. He couldn't keep a schedule. He was always running over, and Adams just thought he was totally unsuccessful in living up to that virtue. Of course, you'd run the risk of being a virtue monger when you start talking about virtue in the abstract. Even Franklin probably saved humility for last because he imagined the reaction to a book, Humility by Benjamin Franklin. It's just by definition you're going to fall short. But here's the thing: think of it as mindfulness or time management or um, emotional intelligence. By definition, if that's what virtue is, of course we're going to fall short because we're going to lose our temper or waste time or not be our best self or get distracted. But it's the practice, the path, the daily, hourly quest that defines the pursuit of happiness. That's why it's called pursuit. It's never something to be obtained. Virtue or perfection is elusive to all. Only a handful of sages in history, Jesus or Socrates, according to Franklin, could actually be perfect. But we, imperfect humans as we are, at least can try. And the goal is every minute, every hour to use our time as best we can, to use our talents to the best of our ability, to be our best self and to serve others.
Well, that's what I admire about them is they were willing to risk being accused of being hypocrites in order to espouse and point towards a higher ideal, in the hopes that by pointing to it, more people would come to it versus not pointing to it. Like, it's better to point to ideals and be vulnerable to criticism than to be silent. And I think that's like a modality that is valuable for us to learn from them.
It's crucial. It's principle that aspires us to live up to our best ideals, and politics unconstrained by principle descends into injustice and war. That's the central lesson of history for the founders. And take slavery. I mean, we can't talk about the founders and virtue without their central hypocrisy, which is slavery. And what so struck me in reading about the way they talked about slavery was that far from denying the hypocrisy, they embraced it. There's that amazing speech from Patrick Henry where he says, "It is not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves, I won't justify it, I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." And that brutal moment of candor, I know it's wicked, but I like the lifestyle and don't want to give it up, was shared by all of the enslavers of that generation. All of them insisted that it was immoral. They all wanted it to end in the future. They expected at that point that it would, because it seemed economically like it was on its way out before the invention of the cotton gin resurrected it and made the South even more entirely dependent on it. But at the same time as they were hypocritical in refusing to end slavery as soon as they thought they should, it was those ideals that inspired another generation of enslaved people and free black people and white abolitionists to encourage the founders to live up to their best ideals. And it was the Declaration that inspired Frederick Douglass to insist that the Constitution be amended to end slavery, and it was the Declaration that inspired David Walker and Ida B. Wells and women's suffrage and so forth. So ideals are extraordinarily important. By definition, we're going to fall short of them. But that's what's distinctive about America and the American experiment is that the founders may have betrayed their ideals, but at least they gave us ideals to aspire to.
So then, with the pursuit of happiness, that phrase specifically, I was surprised at how many different ancient philosophers talked about it and how that phrase was in the zeitgeist. Like, that was in the Like everybody would have known about that phrase before it was ever enshrined in the Constitution. Can you share a little bit more about that? I was so surprised by that.
I was too. And the most exciting thing about doing historical research today is that all the sources are online. It just blows my mind. It's just so amazing that I was able to write this book and read all these great sources just sitting at home. And with word searches, I found that far from being some secret phrase, the phrase "the pursuit of happiness" is everywhere. I mean, you can't escape it. And it's in all the different sources. It's in the classical moral philosophy. It is in Christian theologians who were preaching at the time. It is in the Whig civic Republican sources opposing the king, like Cato's letters. It's in Blackstone's commentary. It's in the leading textbook that Franklin commissioned for the University of Pennsylvania. Everyone uses the phrase "the pursuit of happiness." They all understand it as this form of emotional intelligence and impulse control and virtuous self-mastery, and you just can't escape it. It was just hiding in plain sight.
So then everyone's pursuing that, which again, I do look at the Constitution as kind of an emergent thing. When you create the right soil, beautiful things begin emerging from it. And it did seem like in that there was a confluence of nutrients and thought and commitment and resolve and historical parameters that allowed for this thing to emerge bloodily through conflict, through wrestling. You know, it's not lost on me that I think I read this from your book as well, that after the Constitution was finished, the hardest part was like selling it to everyone who kind of hated it. They had all these framers had to go back to their communities and say, this is what it is. And everybody had a problem with it. And it was fragile and only existed because people were willing to say, okay, like that's not great. Doesn't work for me all the way, but it's enough for us to build from and build on. How do you relate to that even now in your work at the National Constitution Center in terms of compromise, hearing what other people value, building something that works for now? Do you say that it's like part of the central tenet of your work, and why is that important?
Well, you just put it so beautifully about the Constitution emerging from this this hotly contended soil, and it's a practical experiment in government. The founders are jumping off of the failures of the Articles of Confederation, which was too weak to allow for Congress to achieve common purposes like raising enough money to pay the soldiers, which resulted in almost mutiny at Newburgh, which Washington had to quash by appealing to virtue, or to respond to foreign policy challenges. And then they've got this decade of revolutionary era state constitutions that have also failed. Pennsylvania has a unicameral, really weak executive, and a unicameral House and a weak executive, and there's debtors' riots in Massachusetts, and basically they're just trying to do something tough, which is create a constitution strong enough to achieve common purposes, but constrained and limited enough to protect liberty. And they recognized that it was imperfect, but at Franklin's urging, proposed it because they realized that it was the best that they could achieve. And as you said, it was a really tough fight for ratification, and it almost failed. Just a few votes shifting in Virginia might have killed the whole thing before it got started, reminding us of the contingency of history and also the precariousness of politics. But what was so inspiring about the ratification is that the founders appealed to the people's reason, and Hamilton and Madison wrote the Federalist Papers, which are the greatest defense of the Constitution ever. And people read them, and they appealed to their sense of reason, their willingness to compromise, and respected the intelligence of the people to listen to different points of view and to converge on common outcomes in a spirit of compromise. So that's exactly what we're trying to model at the National Constitution Center. We're not taking any policy positions, but simply in the radical act of faith of bringing together strong liberals and strong conservatives to have constitutional conversations, debating not political questions, but constitutional questions, and also having faith in citizens to take the time to spend an hour listening to a podcast about the TikTok ban, or about presidential immunity, or about a contested question of how religious were the founders. You can't do this in sound bites. You actually have to take some time to hear differing points of view, and you have to open your mind up to differing points of view. In many of our programs, I'll sometimes take votes before and after and ask whose mind was changed by the conversation and also whose mind was open to the arguments on the other side. And often just a few people change their mind, but almost everyone's mind is open because they've taken the time to listen. And that's the main thing. Just taking time, slowing down, is by itself an act of civic faith.
Well, and actually taking time to listen, slowing down, finding wisdom in a place where you might not normally look. Uh, I'd like for you to tell our audience about the chapter on Phyllis Wheatley and how her story, her journey, why you included her in the book, and about people finding wisdom and virtue in a place where they would not necessarily have naturally looked.
What an extraordinary story. Phyllis Wheatley, the first published Black poet in America, comes over in chains from Africa as an enslaved teenager. He is sold to the Wheatley family, who, for some reason, decide that she can be educated along with their kids. And she studies the classical philosophers and poets. And after a year of learning how to read and learning about classical philosophy, she begins to write brilliant poetry. And her poems are about virtue and self mastery. And they're so inspiring that they're sent to General Washington, who graciously acknowledges her genius and thanks her for the poems. They're so successful that the city of Boston decides she can't have written these poems. They've got to hold a trial about whether or not this young teenager actually wrote her own poems. So in this amazing display, chaired by John Hancock, the guy who signed the Declaration in big signature, which includes Cotton Mather and all the worthies of the Boston establishment, they have a virtual examination, it's not in person, on the depths of her classical knowledge. And Professor Henry Louis Gates imagines questions like, name the 9 muses, or who was Apollo? But she passes with flying colors, and they certify that she wrote her own poems. And then she becomes an international celebrity, the Oprah Winfrey of her day, Professor Gates calls her. And she goes to London, she meets the Duke and Duchess, she gets the key to the city, she meets Franklin. And there's only one dissenter, and that's Thomas Jefferson. And in a shocking chapter of his notes on the state of Virginia, he calls it the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley. He misspells her name, beneath contempt, because, and he ventures this as a suspicion only, he calls it, he wants to be proved wrong, Black poets are intellectually inferior because they're Black. And what's so shocking about this reaction is that none of the other founders displayed this degree of virulent racism to Wheatley. Washington and Franklin all acclaimed her genius. It was just a dark blot on the founder of the Declaration. He had a degree of personal racism, which was unusual even by the standards of the enslavers of his day. So that's the story, and it's so striking. It's also a tremendous rebuke to those who claim that this classical education is only for the privileged in fancy universities. It just a year of studying the classics in a schoolroom with her young peers made Wheatley the greatest poet of her time, just as this great literature inspired Frederick Douglass. And if I can briefly tell his story, because it is good to pair with Phyllis Wheatley. So Frederick Douglass is enslaved in Baltimore. His mistress starts to teach him how to read, and his wicked master says, don't do that, because then his mind will want to be free, and forbids him from learning how to read. At that point, Douglass feels more shackled than even when his body is in chains. And he goes onto the streets of Baltimore. He buys reading lessons with bread. He pays boys with bread to teach them how to read. And then with bread, he buys a copy of this book, The Columbian Orator. And it contains essays that have excerpts from the classical philosophers, from Cicero, excerpts from Ben Franklin, a dialogue on slavery that convinces Douglass to become an abolitionist because the slave in this dialogue argues for his freedom through the power of his mind. And based on reading this book, which he's bought with bread, Douglass becomes the greatest freedom fighter of his time and transforms the Constitution and argues for the importance of what he calls self-reliance and says that education is crucial to happiness and uh, virtue, completely embracing the classical vision. So it's the most inspiring testament to the power of the human mind, its demand to be free, the power of individual genius, and the power of these books. And if Douglass and Phyllis Wheatley, who were literally enslaved, are able to set the world ablaze with their language just by reading all of this beautiful wisdom, the least the rest of us can do is to take the time to read it on our own.
That's right. And it's powerfully inspiring. And one of the reasons why I mentioned Phyllis specifically, but mentioning Frederick and then even some of the elements of Franklin and others is they were this wonderful paradox. Like Phyllis specifically would write poetry about the power of divine reason. And there's this wonderful thing of this wonderful confluence of rational thought, divine reason, temperance, submitting your passions to something bigger than yourself that would provide the context for self-mastery and self-leadership. And then also there was this art and romance. And she does such an excellent, I think one of the reasons why she rose above is because she embodied both of those things so loudly. Your journey through this, you're in many ways an academic and having a value for bipartisan dialogue, and I make up that you use your mind and rational thought and all the Stoic ideals are embodied in some ways probably your character and your temperament. And in this season of your life, we mentioned before we hopped on that you've been exploring the artistic side, and I think there's even, if I remember right, because I read your book a little while ago, there's like I think you put some of your poetry or you write things in sonnet for this partially for the sake of memorization, but I think also because there's something also human about just the expression there. I'd love for as a person who is a thought leader and a person who has written many books and is known for his mind, I'd like for you to share with our audience a little bit about the journey recently in the arts for you.
Absolutely. It was an unusual, unexpected journey. This habit I developed of waking up, reading the wisdom literature and writing sonnets is extremely weird. And no, I never expected to end up here. My wife, Lauren, is a poet, and I just seeing how she was able to channel poetry, open herself up to it, and have these beautiful poems flow out, maybe emboldened me to try. And I also was inspired by Jefferson's schedule because it's all about habits. And Jefferson said that you got to get up every morning before sunrise, read moral philosophy for 2 hours, and then watch the sunrise. And then you can get on with your 12 hours of reading for the rest of the day. And and
Yeah.
and somehow I was moved to do that during COVID because we all had more time. And I'd never been an early riser before, and certainly didn't write poetry regularly either. But there's something just about the habit, the rhythm of reading for 2 hours, watching the sunrise, which is the most beautiful thing that you can observe in the world, no matter where you are in the world. If you just have the privilege and also the discipline to get up and see the sunrise, it's just a gift, and it's extraordinarily beautiful, and each one is different. So I found myself after getting up and doing my morning reading the urge to sum up the wisdom in sonnet form. And it wasn't with any intent of sharing them. I just wanted to uh, s- synthesize and get my mind around the wisdom of the day. And I tried this both for the classical moral philosophy and also for the Old and New Testaments, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and for the Dhammapada, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Upanishads, the great works of the wisdom literature, just writing short sonnets to sum up the essence of the morning reading. And it was a very unusual and but satisfying project because I felt like I'd assimilated and distilled the wisdom in some form. And that's how the sonnet writing happened. Since I finished the book, uh, what I've kept with me is the habit of using the mornings for productive reading or creative work. So I have a new rule when I wake up, and I'm not always catching the sunrise. I don't want to claim to be a virtue monger,
Yeah.
although I try to. But I guess it's daylight savings time now, so it's easy because it's rising late now. But in the morning when I wake up, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've done uh, reading or creative work. And it's a simple but a really life-changing, transformative habit. I mean, it's totally changed my life. I wake up in the morning and I'm addicted to these devices, of course, and I'm tempted to check my email or to browse the newspapers or something silly like that. And I'm not allowed to do that. I have to swipe left to the Kindle where I read rather than to email or browsing. And that has resulted in my getting back into the habit of deep reading. And it allowed me to write in this other book on Hamilton and Jefferson and learn something new every day. And it's so exciting and it's just a habit. I did it when I was a kid, but I'd fallen out of the habit of reading for stuff that wasn't related to immediate deadlines. And now, I have to read in the morning, and I learned a lot. But the exception is if I'm not reading a book, then I have to do something creative. And um, it could be writing a poem, but about a year ago, I found myself writing songs, and I never expected to do that. But I woke up one morning with just a tune and a song in my head, and suddenly they just started flowing out. And it's a discipline because you just have to open yourself and not be doing something else. If you wake up with a melody or you just want to pin it down and write the lyrics. But I've written a whole lot of songs now, and I'm very excited, actually more excited than about any other creative endeavor, that I just met a music professor who has offered to have the songs arranged, and then she'll play them, and we'll get a professional singer for them. So I think when they do a debut album or two of there are a couple albums. One are songs of virtue and self mastery, all about enthusiasm and calm self mastery and industry and temperance. They're kind of funny little songs like that. And then there's an album about the Greek gods and goddesses, which are more in the Gilbert and Sullivan style, but are hopefully amusing. And then I set the poems of John Milton, who is the great writer of Paradise Lost, but he translated the Psalms in the most beautiful language, and his poetry is so musical. We were talking about the music of poetry, and next to Shakespeare, there's no one more musical, so I set those. So that's what we're doing, and it's just, you feel like you made something, and they're short, but you like the whole day hasn't been totally squandered when you wake up and you either read something or make something, and that's what I've been doing with my mornings.
Well, and I love that. And I remember, like, when I went through the pandemic, Dan Leffelar, who's one of our managing partners of the firm, he told me, if you work with your hands for a living, you want to rest with your mind. And if you work with your mind for a living, you want to rest with your hands. And I thought that was so interesting. And so then actually I picked up the piano during the pandemic, and now I play every day, or almost every day. And it's this life-giving thing. And it's I love seeing people embody the paradox of both passion and reason. And so even if you're listening to this, you may be thinking, well, Jeff, he's in a season of life where he has more time for that or whatever. And I promise you, Jeff's very busy. And you want to, as you go into 2025, because this is dropping in January, I really want to encourage you to find the wisdom resources you trust to help inform your sense of civic duty, your sense of self-mastery, your sense of reason. Like find things worth submitting to in that regard. And then also find things worth being passionate about, and find things worth being romantic about, and find things worth being creative about. And if you can hold those two things together, I think Jeff would agree, it really creates a lovely life, and that it's not time-based. What I mean by that is not like the season of life. Like, do it now. Don't wait till later to do it.
So beautifully expressed. That's exactly right. No, we must do it now. Just do it. To use every moment, hold every moment in your grasp, said Seneca. Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools we mortals be. The one virtue that I was inspired to practice by reading about all these great founders and philosophers is industry. You just don't want to waste time. You want to hold every moment in your grasp, use it productively. Louis Brandeis, one of my heroes, who is a great admirer of both Thomas Jefferson and the Greeks, and he thought 5th century Athens was the apotheosis of civilization. This is Justice Louis Brandeis. He was so excited to learn that the Greek word for leisure was unemployment. A schola. He said, what a happy land this where, unemployment is leisure. But for him and for the Greeks, leisure, or the time of unemployment, is not a time to work less. It's to work more, but more at creative activities that will allow us to learn and grow and to achieve self-mastery and expand our capacities and use our time productively. So that, in that sense, the better you use time, the more productive you are, because you're just making the most of every minute that we're given on this earth. And you also feel better. And this is the takeaway. I mean, it can seem kind of arduous to be, happiness is being good, not feeling good. It seems like such a drag or so puritanical. But in fact, when you use your time well, you just feel better. I know the feeling of self-loathing I have when I've been browsing for like an hour, totally mindless gossip or foolish email stuff. You think, God, that was a waste of time. But you make a song, or you read a book and you learn something. The whole day seems redeemed, and you feel good as well as being good.
You feel pleasure when you eat processed sugars, but you don't feel good.
Yes, yes.
There's a distinction there, and that I love that. It's something. Not to belabor this too much, but I remember coming home one time. I used to be a professor at Pepperdine University, and I was coming home from work, and I had a roommate at the time, and he oftentimes hosted these kind of up and coming actors in Hollywood, and so I would come into this room full of all these actors, and I remember getting really excited, and because I was thinking about like what makes life meaningful, what makes life purposeful, and I remember thinking something around the idea of like maturity, like to be mature, it really opens things up for people. It really gives people access to agency and really allows people to create in the world. And so I was really excited about the word maturity. And I remember coming into this room full of actors and saying, I'm excited about this thing. And like, what is it? I'm like, maturity. And I remember them being so turned off by that. They were like, why would anyone, and this is LA, the land of like perpetual Peter Pans. They were like, why would anyone ever want to be mature? And it broke my heart, and I realized that like virtue has a marketing problem.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. The word virtue and maturity are so off-putting. Wisdom and understanding are a little bit more inviting. But what the real goal is to merge with the eternal harmonies of the universe and with the divine. It's ultimately a spiritual quest, and people will define and understand spiritual quests in different ways, of course, but it's difficult to talk about except in those terms. And you know it when you feel it. Really, ultimately, it is a matter of feeling as much as knowing.
Jeff, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for your time. I'm grateful for your work. If you're listening to this, please check out the National Convention Center. Please check out, or Constitution Center rather. Please check out Jeff's book, The Pursuit of Happiness, along with several other books, including biographies on Taft, on Supreme Court justices. You've written a lot about the Supreme Court. Your work and your life is really interesting, and we've only scratched the surface of it. But I raise a glass to you, sir. Like, as we step into 2025, may our lives be full of the divine pursuit of wisdom and life, and may others who are listening to this also be inspired by your work as I have. The pursuit of happiness is a worthy pursuit, and the best is yet to come. Thank you so much for your time.
Well said. Thank you so much for reading the book so closely, and thank you for a wonderful conversation.
It's been a pleasure. All right, we have a few more things to let you know about before we go. First, podcast reviews really help us serve more people. So if this podcast is helpful for you, we'd love your help to get it into as many leaders' hands as possible. Please leave us a review, even if it's not 5 stars. And if you really want to go the extra mile, let us know what you'd like to hear more of, or what you think we could do better to serve you and the people you care about. Okay, second, we have more resources for you online, and they're all free. We have free assessments, educational videos, articles from sources like Fast Company, written by our coaches and clients, all designed to help you use our tools in your everyday life and leadership. To dive into the free treasure trove of goodies we have for you, go to novus.global and then click on resources. Some of you have been listening for a while, and you haven't yet taken that next step to hire a coach. This is your time. I can't tell you how often I've heard from clients around the world that they wish they would have talked to us sooner. If you have a sense that you're capable of more, we would be thrilled to explore what coaching could do for you and those you influence. Simply email us at begin@novus.global or click the link in the show notes. You also might be listening to this thinking, maybe you want to be a coach, or maybe you already are and you have a vision to build a 6 or 7 figure practice coaching people you love in a way that brings life to you and your clients. Well, that's why we created the Meta Performance Institute for Coaching. It is an in-depth coaching apprenticeship designed to help you create the coaching practice of your dreams. The first step in exploring that is simple. Just go to www.mp, as in Meta Performance, .institute. There we have free assessments to help you see what kind of training you need to create the coaching practice the way our coaches do at Novus Global. Finally, this show was produced by Rainbow Creative with Matthew Jones as executive producer, Steven Selnick as producer, and Rob Johnson as audio editor and engineer. We love working with this team. Find out more about how to create a podcast for you and your business at rainbowcreative.co. Thank you so much for listening. We love making these for you. And remember, dare to go beyond high performance.